for the project, I thought it would be a good idea to have a list of items where there were common mistakes. And since I graded a whole bunch of these toward the end of the fall semester, putting a list together was something that was doable. It came out sort of stream of consciousness, and I had to spend a lot of time organizing it, but putting the list together itself actually didn't take too long. But I figured this was a good thing to have. And what I should say before we get into this is that if I have to take off a bunch of points at once, so if it's not a situation where it's maybe a point here for something that's a little bit wrong, or a point over here for something that's a little bit wrong, if I have to take off a whole bunch of points at once, it's for stuff that's just not there. So that's the biggest thing to start off with, is make sure you get everything in there that's on the rubric and everything that's there on that document that explains what you're supposed to have in the project. Because usually those are the things I end up taking off for. Something like the description of why you picked the inequality that you picked. That's a big one where sometimes it's just not there. And if that's not there, I can't give any partial credit. So that's the first big thing, is just make sure you get everything in there. But other than that, what this video is going to be is mostly just kind of running through stuff where it's like, this is mostly right, but a lot of times people leave this part out, so you don't want to forget to put this part in. First of all, I guess in general, before we get into specific parts of the project, ways that you can miss points in general. One would be having a bulleted list instead of writing out the project in paragraph form. Even though some of those documents that I posted for the examples are as a bulleted list, that's just to make it easier to kind of piece together an outline, which I think from there to get to a write-up isn't too bad. But just to have the outline first as sort of an itemized way of making sure, like, okay, I got that, I got that, I got that. I think that's helpful. And that's kind of why I made it that way. But your project does need to be written in paragraph form, not as a bulleted list. Having the entire thing as one giant paragraph is a bad idea, and I do have to take off for that. So there is that secondary document, which I think is called setup or general setup, something like that, where it says, in the first paragraph you want this stuff, maybe in the second paragraph you want this, maybe in the third paragraph you want this, where you don't have to do it that way, but that's a template that I thought would be pretty logical, although you don't want to have it all as one giant paragraph. Not that I have to take off a ton, but I'd probably take off a point for it. If there are multiple grammar or punctuation mistakes, usually that's not an issue when the project is done by one person. It's more of an issue where if it's done by like 3 people, where then if it's this part's written by this person, this other part's written by somebody else, and eventually they're all cobbled together and the formatting was different to begin with, and that ends up getting preserved in the final document, that's kind of where you end up with a bunch of mistakes sort of by accident. So I guess just make sure that you proofread it either way before you turn it in, whether you're doing it by yourself or you're doing the project with 1 or 2 other people. But that's where you tend to see it, actually. It's more when it's a project that's cobbled together, written by multiple people, and then sort of compiled into one document. That's where you kind of have to be vigilant with that. And then the other common thing, let's see, screenshots interspersed with the write-up. So you don't want to have some wording and then a screenshot and then some more wording, then another screenshot or anything like that. You want all of the wording first, so a few paragraphs, and then the screenshots. So the way I would think about it is maybe all the wording on the first page and then the screenshots on page 2, or page 2 and then spilling onto page 3 maybe for the screenshots. Something to that effect. The other general thing, which this is rare, I think I saw it twice in the fall out of like 61 or 62 projects, but make sure you have a quantitative variable. So it's supposed to be for a single mean or a difference of means. Just make sure you've got that. If it's something that has to do with a proportion, that's significantly less work with getting the p-value, because there's a lot less that you have to do with the data entry and things like that. And that's why it's set up this way. It's set up to where that way I can keep it sort of equitable, where the work is about the same no matter what. And I mean, that's really the reason. And so I guess just make sure you have a quantitative variable. That's a rare thing. It actually didn't happen last summer, but it came up twice in the fall, so I figured I would say it. Let's see. Next thing, alternative hypothesis in words. The biggest thing that I can remember being a common mistake there is leaving out the word mean or average, I guess either in one spot or in two spots, depending on if you have a one sample test or a two sample test. So make sure you get that in there. That's easy to forget, and it wouldn't be a ton of points off if it's not there, if everything else was correct. But just make sure that you don't leave that out. You're either comparing a population mean to some value or you're comparing two population means. So the word mean or average needs to be there every time you're writing out what one of the parameters would be. What I would consider doing, just to be safe, is maybe if you wrote out the hypotheses and symbols first, and then after that just translated the symbols into words being as exhaustive as you could. I think doing that might act as a safeguard against leaving stuff out. The other thing that people tend to occasionally leave out with the alternative hypothesis and words is leaving out qualifiers. This tends to be an issue if your data come from some kind of database. So like if you're looking at used cars and you're using AutoTrader, something like that, where then what you're going to be looking at is going to be within some radius of some zip code. So within 100 miles of zip code 40502 or something to that effect. Whatever you're using as those qualifiers, you want to make sure you include that as part of your parameter as well, in most cases. So I guess then at that point you probably want to think, okay, well, what's my population supposed to be? And if my sample is being drawn directly from that, and I've got these qualifiers in there, those probably relate to the population too. So just make sure that you get those in there if you need to get those in there. Let's see, the next thing is the explanation of the inequality. That's one where, like I said a few minutes ago, usually if I take off points there, it's because the whole thing just is missing. But there is a way to have a significant point mistake that actually comes up a lot, which is leaving out the justification for a two-sided alternative. For saying that you're going to use that but then not really specifying it. So something like, I used the two-sided alternative because I didn't know which direction to pick. That ends up being kind of a circular statement because there really isn't a justification there. There isn't a, well, it could go this way because of this, like it could be a greater than because of this thing, or it could be a less than because of this, so either of them seem plausible, so we went with a two-sided alternative. Something like that is what you want. I know I said that very generally, but because this is so open-ended, I kind of have to. But that's the thing that you want to have in there. Just saying I didn't know which one doesn't really go too far as the justification is concerned. So just make sure you elaborate on that to the extent that you can to say, well, it could have been this way or it could have been this way. And this is a problem that's specific to the two-sided alternative. Usually when it's a one-sided alternative, people don't forget it. It's, I picked this direction because, and then there's the justification. But when it's a two-sided one, that's still got to be in there. And the other thing that can be trouble, this wasn't one that really came up a whole lot in the fall, but it does come up once in a while, is choosing the inequality based on the sample data. So saying, well, we picked a greater than because x1 bar was bigger than x2 bar. That's a bad idea, and logically that doesn't really work. Whatever you're going to pick for the inequality in the alternative hypothesis technically should be determined before you actually collected sample data. So that's a thing I would have to take off for if the justification for your inequality was, well, because this is what the sample looks like. Because that's really out of order from a logical perspective. Let's see. The next thing is the explanation of the constant term. How thorough you have to be with that varies a lot, because if it's something with housing, then you can find those values on Zillow, like the median for the county or the median for the state or something like that. And then you can just say, well, here's this number. It's the median for this county or it's the median for the state, and it's in the screenshot. I looked it up on Zillow, and that's what I ended up with. And that's basically the entire justification or the entire explanation of where your constant term came from. For something with used cars, if you're just going to have a one sample test there, then if you use something from Kelley Blue Book or maybe the NADA, something like that, then you have to put in a value for the mileage, and then you end up having to explain that. Like, is it okay, I'm looking at vehicles from 2014, so they're 4 years old. So then what do you put in for the mileage? Do you just put in something multiplied by 4 since they're 4 years old, so like 12,000 multiplied by 4? Or do you use the average value from the mileage that was in your sample? That would be a reasonable thing to pick to stick into that form on the website to figure out eventually a constant term that you can use. So with a vehicle, that's actually much more difficult. The way that I would work around that is if you're going to use anything vehicle related, just make sure it's a 2-sample test. That way you don't have to worry about the constant term. That would be my advice there, because those are long to make sure you get everything in. The next thing, at least as far as the real order of the project goes, would be the description of how sample data are collected. I know that's not the order of the rubric, but that rubric is actually kind of rearranged just so it fits on 2 sheets of paper. So as far as how the sample data were collected, things that tend to be left out would be, like if you have a sample of a sample, which is what I've got behind me here. This is an Auto Trader search for Ford Rangers, where the search I did, and this probably isn't visible, it's actually right up here. I've got 271 results. So that's one where you don't have to use all 271. If you want to use a sample of the sample, that's fine. So if this was going to be a 1-sample test, then I would maybe just take the first 30 and say that's going to be my sample. That's okay, but then you have to mention that in your project that it is a sample of a sample. So to say there were 271 results and I used the first 30. That's got to be in there. One other thing would be occasionally leaving all the qualifiers out. So this specifically for things like houses and cars, you're going to have qualifiers that factor into your search. And I don't know if this is going to be visible in the video or not, but it's over here. So I'm kind of circling with my hand right now, where you have to specify a zip code. So I put in 40502, and then you have to specify a radius, which I put in 200 miles. So those sorts of things would also be part of the description of how the sample data were collected, that there were those restrictions. So within 200 miles of 40502, at least in my case, that's what it is. Another thing, and this is kind of a rare one, but it's worth mentioning, whatever your variable of interest is, don't put any restrictions on that. So here, mine is the cost of Ford Rangers. So what I'm not going to do is put any kind of upper bound or lower bound on the price. So that is an option. It's actually over here, and I'm going to leave that alone because you don't want to put any restrictions on the variable of interest. If that happens, I do have to take off a little bit. One other thing that I wanted to point out in this part is that you could have a situation where you couldn't have what would be considered a big enough sample for the project. And that's okay if that's what your subject matter entails. So here I have Martin County real estate. So Martin County, if you don't know where it is, it's out in eastern Kentucky. It's near the West Virginia border. So it's in Appalachia, and it's not very heavily populated. So if you look over here, there are 9 results. So I don't know if that's visible or not. It's right there, 9 results. And that's going back 3 years. That's all that they're going to have in their database. And if that's what you end up with, that's okay. So in that case where you couldn't get up to 30 just based on what your subject matter is, I would allow that, but that's going to be kind of a rare thing. It would have to be if you're searching a database and you just don't get very much. So I suppose that would be something like this, where if you're looking at real estate in kind of a sparsely populated area, or maybe if you're looking up vehicles and you're looking at vehicles that are kind of rare. And another thing that I wanted to point out here, specific to real estate, is look at this listing right here. This one doesn't have anything other than the price because it doesn't have the number of bathrooms, doesn't have square footage. Some people don't like to use those incomplete listings. If you want to dump them out, all you have to do is change the minimum square footage to be 1, and that'll get rid of them. I'll show you what I mean. The other things that you might want to change, I did here, and I know this shows up in one of those example videos, but I did change the type of houses up here to recently sold only. And right here where it says home type, I changed that to houses only. But then the other thing is if you want to dump things like this, where there are these incomplete listings, if you go to more, then change the square feet to have a minimum of 1, then you'll get rid of it. And then in this case, you only have 8 results, but they're 8 complete results. So if you feel more comfortable doing that, then you can do it if you're going to do anything that relates to housing. The next couple of parts don't tend to cause a whole lot of trouble. The next part being the statement including the p-value and the decision about the null hypothesis. If you follow what I've got up here as a template, you'll be fine, and it'll work out perfectly. So the p-value is whatever you get for the p-value. So then either the null should be rejected or it shouldn't. So considering that the significance level is going to be 0.05, you're going to reject the null if the p-value is less than that. So if your p-value is 0.0304, you'd say the p-value is 0.0304, so the null hypothesis should be rejected. If your p-value is kind of big, let's say it's 0.4827, then you'd say the p-value is 0.4827, so the null hypothesis should not be rejected. That's about all you have to get in there. The next part about the formal conclusion, this doesn't tend to cause a lot of trouble either. So basically this entirely hinges on your p-value as well. If your p-value is small, if it's less than alpha, that's when you're going to reject the null, and that's also when you're going to have sufficient evidence to conclude that the alternative looks like it's correct. So in that case, you got a p-value less than alpha, you're going to say there is sufficient evidence to conclude whatever your alternative hypothesis is. And here, basically, you can just sort of parrot whatever you have in the early part of the paper where you have to write out the alternative hypothesis in words. You can just kind of replicate it down there. The other option is if your p-value is bigger than alpha, that's when you would fail to reject the null, and that's when you would say there is insufficient evidence to conclude what's in the alternative. Those are really your only 2 options here. It's one or the other, and again, this one doesn't cause a whole lot of trouble. The next thing would be the reservations or limitations that you'd have due to the sampling method. The one thing that's sort of a common mistake there is that if your population is already restricted in the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis to some subset of the US, and this tends to be a thing like with used cars, where it's within 200 miles of 40502 or whatever it happens to be, then that's what your population is, and then saying, well, that doesn't really apply to the entire US, that's okay. Your population wasn't the entire US to begin with. It was whatever was there in the alternative hypothesis. So if your sample is entirely coming out of that, that would not be a problem. The things that are probably going to be an issue, well, first of all, almost nobody is going to have a random sample. So if you don't have a random sample, which is going to be very likely, then just explain that part of it. Say, this isn't a random sample because the way that we got our sample was like this, and this part of it's not random. Maybe it's you used Zillow listings and there were 1,500 of them. You used the first 30, but the way that Zillow tends to order things is most recent first, so you took the 30 most recent ones. That's not a random sample. So things like that, or I guess in that case, like with a Zillow search, not every house that's for sale is going to be listed on Zillow, so there are individuals in the population that couldn't possibly end up in the sample, right? You can bring that in too. The one other thing, and this does come up every once in a while, where if there are multiple reservations or limitations there, like let's say hypothetically if there are 3 of them and 2 of them are right but 1 of them is wrong, then I'd have to take 1 point off for that if there is one that's incorrect. All right, for the other stuff that's not writing, for the CSV file, I would suggest making that before you even get to the point where you're using StatKey to get the p-value. Because if you make the CSV file first, you only have to type the data once. So how do you make the CSV file? Well, I've got the Martin County screen up here from Zillow with the 8 results. I stuck those into an Excel spreadsheet. And if you look at what I've got here, the way that this is formatted, this is how you want to do it. So you want a header of some kind, so I just put Martin County with no spaces. That seemed pretty simple. And then I have the 8 values there. You'd have your 30 or however many you've got. And then you just go from there. Okay, so I have it as an Excel file. That's not really what you want because StatKey won't be able to read it. You need to save it as a CSV file. So what you would want to do is you want to go to File and then Save As, And then I guess I have to put it somewhere. Okay, I'll just put it here. And then you just change the format to, so you want the general one down here. So the thing that I have highlighted right now, where it says CSV, comma delimited, that's what you want. There are other CSVs in there, like the CSV UTF-8. I wouldn't save it that way, or the CSV Macintosh, or the CSV DOS. The comma delimited one, that's the universal one that should work everywhere where there wouldn't be any issues with it. That's what I would do. So save it as that, and then you'll be all set. So I guess I just kind of ran through what you want for a single sample. If you have two samples, so if you're comparing means, I would say the best thing to do is look at the Eureka and Yreka example for how to do that. It's a little unconventional the way that you do that with StatKey compared to the way that you would do it with basically any other software. So just follow along with the way that I've got that one set up, and I think you'll be fine. The next thing is what you want in StatKey, which is what I've got behind me. What I did here is I took that Martin County data that I put into the CSV file, and then I uploaded it. And you can see over here the original sample box, if it's readable, that n equals 8. And then you've got the sample mean there, which the sample mean here, it's 92,203.125. That's also the cutoff right there. That's an easy way of getting it. Once you have your sample data uploaded, StatKey will tell you right here what your cutoff is supposed to be. So don't do that computation by hand. Let StatKey do that work for you. But this is what you want your screenshot of the p-value to look like, where not only is the randomization distribution there, but the cutoff is specified, and you can see the p-value. Because here, you got the 0.089 here, you got the 0.089 there, so it looks like the p-value is 0.178. Right there, it's nice and visible. So what you would want to do to get the screenshot into, let's say, a Word file, the print screen key is kind of the easy way of doing this. And then paste, and it's in there. Then from here, I guess if you wanted to cut it down a little bit, so I don't need really any of that stuff. And I guess down here, I don't need the, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. I don't need the bar and stuff at the bottom. I can cut it down to about there, and there. That's about what you'd want, right? I mean, I guess I could chop off the blue stuff on the sides too. Honestly, when I do these, when I do the screenshots, I actually do them in Paint. So, like, I use the print screen key, and then I paste into Paint, and there I just cut out a big rectangle with everything in it, and then I copy that over. But in a way, that feels like an intermediate step. So you could do it that way, or you could do it where you would have one screenshot that was just this part, and then one screenshot that was the original sample box. Those are the two things you got to have, but if you just do it as one giant piece, I would imagine that you'll be fine. Other stuff that I need to mention at the very end, any screenshots. So sample data screenshots, constant term screenshots. You want to have screenshots of the actual things, like in the examples. So like in the Kybers example, or in the Eureka and Yreka example. You want screenshots where the constant term is visible, or for the sample data, you at least want to have maybe a couple or a handful of individual values visible in the picture. What you don't want to have is a screenshot of a URL that then the constant term is at that URL, right? It needs to be explicit, like right there in the picture. Then the other thing that I wanted to mention was if you're collecting your own data, whether it's through a survey or if it's like that Gala Apple old example that I posted, what you need to have is something that could stand in for the screenshots of the sample data that you would get if you searched a database. So even if it's just a picture of a single measurement, or I guess that would be the case like with the Gala apples, if you had a picture of one apple being measured and then that measurement is in your data set, I guess that would work. Or if it's something where you have people fill out a survey, then what you would want, I think, would be a screenshot of the survey itself with the question that you're asking visible, and then maybe a screenshot of the summary data. Like if you're going to use SurveyMonkey, there should be a summary data that you could access, and then just a screenshot of that as well. I think that would work. So that's usually the way it goes when people collect their own data. Usually it's a survey, probably through SurveyMonkey. So there, I think just those two things. So screenshot of the question you're asking and screenshot of the summary. That should do it. Or if you wanted to have a screenshot of the individual values, if you could get it, that would be great. But depending on, I guess, how complex your survey is, maybe you can get that, maybe you can't.